I would like to introduce the facilitator of this session, Jolle Demmers. Jolle Demmers is Associate Professor and co-founder of the Center for Conflict Studies, based at the History of International Relations Department here at the Utrecht University. She has background in political science, international relations, and anthropology, and lectures and writes on theories of violent conflict, securitizing conflict diasporas, and neoliberalism. We've collaborated together on a number of projects, and specifically I would like to mention one collaboration, which was 2014 project of New World Embassy, Azawad by Musa Ag Assarit and Jonas Dahl. Musa Ag Assarit is a representative of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad, MNLA. And here she engaged in the very important and interesting opening discussion and conference, where she engaged the culture imaginary of autonomist and independentist groups in a lecture titled Bluffing the State. Here she talked about the process of both mimicking and contesting traditional enactments of statehood, and I think this is something we could take into our conversation on specifically hegemonic institutions and usage of hegemonic concepts for non-hegemonic use, which could be one of the potentially interesting strategies for us to engage in. Jolle, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Next to democracy, capitalism, and the state, the word crisis or crises is mentioned quite a lot over the past days. We live in a time of crises, at least that's what we're told. For Antonio Gramsci, a crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. This weekend we discuss how many ways structures of the old are still holding great power over us, but we'll also examine alternative practices and the creation of counter-realities and future vocabularies. Now, I think it's not so much the problem of the new not being born, but more the problem to have the new ideas reach and convince larger audiences. And I'll try and come back to that later today. But first, I want to introduce our amazing panel. We're very happy to have them here. Jonas already mentioned a number of them, and I give a brief introduction into their biographies, and then I will give a brief introduction into the topic of future representations, and then we're going to have conversations, 10-minute conversations with each of these artists, and then we'll open up the floor. So that's how it is. We're not going to have people standing behind cathedrals giving lectures. We're going to have a conversation. So it's a bit different. That's why we're also sort of changed the setting a little, and we're just sitting here and talking. So I want to introduce you to Ilena Saturay. She's an artist and representative of the National Democratic Movement of the Philippines. The movement gained its strength during the period of the US-backed Marcos dictatorship from 1972 to 1986 as the Communist Party of the Philippines, and its armed wing, the New People's Army, rose to power in many localities throughout the country by mobilizing the peasant and worker populations by means of guerrilla tactics. Since the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, subsequent governments have continued to sell off land to foreign investors and their private militias, strengthening this broad resistance movement. Ilena is further active in several organizations confronting social and political issues such as migrant rights, women's rights, and social justice. In October 2015, she was a speaker at the 5th New World Summit in Rojava. We have Emry Douglas with us. Emry Douglas was the revolutionary artist and minister of culture for the Black Panther Party from 1967 until its ending in 1982. Douglas' artwork and design formed a very powerful signature for social justice during this era, and his revolutionary art continues to support the struggle against social injustice transcending borders. Emry has had retrospective exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and the New Museum in New York, And since Friday, he's taking part in Richard Bell's exhibition at the Stedelijk Museum Bureau Amsterdam, titled Bell Invites, that you all have to go and see. An overview of his work was published as Black Panther, the Revolutionary Art of Emry Douglas. We have it here in the bookshop for just for you to see. We didn't have copies to sell, unfortunately, but it's really worth taking a look to see this fantastic artwork. Richard Bell is here with us today, sitting here. He's an Australian artist and political activist and a member of the Kamila Roy, Kuma, Jiman, and Gurang Gurang communities. He is an active voice in the Aboriginal Tent Embassy and one of the founders of Proper Now, a Brisbane-based Aboriginal art collective. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy is the longest-running protest action in Australian history, standing for over 50 years now. Richard Bell claims it as the greatest piece of performance art to have taken place in Australia. Since 2013, Richard has been organizing an Aboriginal Tent Embassy to the art world, which hosts screenings, poetry, and debates. Bell remolds the role of the artist to that of cultural ambassador, and he's a great alliance builder and inspiration for many young artists, and a master of the rebellious image. Currently, Bell's work, as I said, is on display in the Stedelijk Museum Bureau Amsterdam in an exhibition titled Bell Invites, including the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, curated by Vivian Sigero. We have Callum sitting here next to me, Callum Clayton-Dixon. He is an Anai one, okay, and a member of the Aboriginal Provisional Government, an organization formed in 1990 to campaign the Aboriginal sovereignty and self-determination. Callum will talk about his Aboriginal Passport. He is a founding member of the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance, an organization of young Aboriginal people committed to decolonization and Aboriginal nationalism. He also co-edits Aboriginal activist magazine Black Nations Rising, which promotes symbols, stories, and strategies of resistance and revival. And then we have Vivian sitting here opposite. Sigel is a curator from Brisbane, living and working in Amsterdam. Vivian is the founder of Frontier Imaginaries, which departs from Australian dialogues such as climate debates, the offshoring and enclosure of asylum seekers, ongoing Indigenous struggles, and urban-rural divides. She's further curated major projects around the globe, including the Aboriginal Tent Embassy with the Stedelijk Museum, and she's taught at the Dutch Art Institute in Arnhem and in critical studies at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. So a very warm welcome to this fantastic panel. Okay. The gaze of the artist and the social scientist or the academic, I think, is not that different. Both aim to question the categorizations we live by, to look at things, to look at phenomena as if we see them for the first time. That is at least what I try and tell my students. Try and look at the world as if you have just landed here. Destabilize stable meanings in the shadow of powerful explanations. Study also the built environment and question how space generates a certain form of being, a certain form of subjectivity. Who's welcomed and who is expelled? What are the rules of the game here? Take nothing for granted, question everything. This panel, as I see it, helps us to explore the art of creating counter-realities, to visualize alternatives. Parties in conflict or parties in contestation always are, in a way, constructed entities that are made socially effective through imaginative and symbolic devices. Through visual representations and performative practices, actors in conflict aim to represent themselves as real, as tangible entities with spatial properties. And only through that they can claim legitimacy, imagine victory, and turn tables. What we see here, I think, is constructivism stretched to its limits. Because a phenomena may be constructed, that is imagined, but as soon as people start to act upon an imagined phenomena, it becomes real in its consequences. And we will talk about how imaginations of Aboriginal citizenship and self-determination are made tangible in the 10th Embassy and the passport, presenting us with the enactment of this idea, with new materials, new scripts, and contentious bureaucratic routines, but also on the role of theater as a way to mobilize people into action, breaking down the fourth wall as a barrier of engagement. Now, the point of departure of this panel is that architectural and visual forms and props, monuments, embassies, passports, border crossings, drawings, shopping malls, theaters, have political and economic impacts on the social systems in which they operate. Buildings, including the Aboriginal 10th Embassy, but also, of course, this very summit, offer cues suggesting how people should act. They tell us about our relationship with one another. So what performance is this? What game are we playing here together? What is the summit doing to you, with you? Are we seeking shelter here? What do we find here? Does it offer us new ways of engagement? And I hope we can discuss this a bit later too, what the summit is helping us to do. The work of our speakers today informs us on how art and visual representations work as collective action frame, as a repertoire of contention, as contentious performance. Now, in the social sciences, and I'm going to be playing the lecture here for a minute, the field of collective action is intrigued by exactly this question, by how and why people get mobilized for collective action, often against the state. Contentious politics is used by people who lack regular access to institutions, act in the name of new or unaccepted claims, and behave in ways that fundamentally challenge others. Fundamentally challenge the old. And I think we've seen many, many examples of this over the past days. These three items of lack of access, the formulation of new or unaccepted claims and identities, and the way these are challenging to the old. In the literature, three building blocks are seen as vital in explaining the possibility, maybe even the magic, for collective action. And there's also always these three components are mentioned. Political opportunity is necessary, organizational capacity is extremely important, but the third one is framing, and I want to talk about that particularly with our panel today. Collective action frames redefine social conditions as unjust and intolerable, with the intention of mobilizing potential participants, which is achieved by making appeals to perceptions of justice and emotionality in the minds of individuals. Now, this kind of framing work is by no means easy. It is no simple matter to convince repressed or timid people that the indignities of everyday life are not in the stars, not written in the stars, and can be attributed to some agent, and that they can change their condition by taking action collectively. And I think the role of art and visuals is a key component in framing work, and here it is where the work of our panelists come in. So, how can art mobilize certain people to join into doing things differently? We have here artists from the US, from Australia, from the Philippines. How do visuals and art forms travel? How are they organized? How are they assembled? How do you forge alliances? How are global assemblages of resistance formed, linking props, enactments, discourses, material, visuals, actors? We've had the Azawadian embassy already here at BAC. So now we're talking about another embassy. So it's interesting how these ideas apparently, are contagious or they travel. Also, the idea of the passport is something that might inspire other stateless peoples. So I want to engage in a conversation with each of the panelists for about 10 minutes, which is insanely short, but just, to learn from them and maybe in the plenary to learn more from them. I want to ask you the question, to look back into the stuff you've done and tell us something about the work that worked, the work that, you look back on and you think, yeah, that was really something that resonated, that actually helped mobilize people in this magical way of getting people out of their submission. So basically, that is my one and only question to you. Can you tell us about the work that worked? And I'd love to start with Ilena.
Thank you. Let me share you a work, not as an individual, but as a part of the national democratic movement in the Philippines. In a faraway village where there is no cinemas, no electricities, the People's Army, the new People's Army, people who have never been in an art academy before or studied art, they prepared a musical for the people that told a story of a young peasant whose land was confiscated by the landlords. And they were playing it, performing it before an audience. And in the scene where the young peasant was so frustrated, he decided to join the People's Army. And then in the scene where he went to his comrades and told them, "Comrades, I have decided to join you," at that scene, suddenly someone from the audience came and said, "Comrades, I have also come to join you." And that was not part of the script of the play. And then suddenly, one by one, people started coming and they joined the People's Army, like 20 of them. Of course, the script was totally changed. But it was something that really represents what art should do. Art that represents them so much that the people felt that it belonged to them, that they can determine the outcome. It represents them and their struggle. So I hope you let me explain how they have achieved, how these artists have achieved that kind of representation from the people. When we look at the Filipino revolutionary movement, you see a lot of artworks. There are theater plays, songs, poetries, etc. And what do? They challenge the system. They expose the rottenness of the system. They incite the people to take action and change it. But it's not only that. It's not what it's all about. It's more than that, The theme of this block is called future representation. But we think what is really important is not just representation. What really, really essential in this matter is participation. What does that mean? Art has bloomed in the revolution, but that's not primarily because we have excellent artists. No, that is because we have a revolution going on. People look at artists as creative people, but they don't imagine things. Their artworks do not come from imagination. They come from the struggle of the people. And if I now declare myself an artist and paint the revolution, sign my name at the bottom of the painting and put it on a museum, I wouldn't call myself a representative of the revolution. My works do not represent the movement of the people. No. In the experience, I hope you let me share some experiences from the artists in the Philippines. The artists there do what we call mass integration, where the artists go to the masses. They go to the peasants, to the workers, to the urban poor and other oppressed sectors of society. And they don't go there for an hour or a day to interview them and get their stories out and make an artwork out of it, like parasites. No. They live with them, they work with them, they join in their struggle. And that's what makes their artwork great, They are them. The greatest artworks are created in the mobilizations, in the picket lines, in the workplace, in the barricades. in the villages and in the mountains where artists hold one pencil on his one hand and an AK-47 with the other. And what is also important is that the artistic skills that they have do not only belong to themselves. They make it accessible to the masses. So the theater plays and murals were made by people who have never held a pencil before or went to an art academy. It is not something elite that people should not have access to. Everybody can be an artist. And I remember the first time I gave a theater workshop in a peasant community. I was just new in the organization and I had no idea how to do it. So I went there to the peasants and I was teaching them some movements on how to plant rice. And I was doing like this, you know? And I remember them laughing at me. They were telling me, "Hey comrades, why do you look like you are washing clothes with your hands?" And they said, here's how you do it. And then I realized, you know, I came there, a girl from the city who had never planted rice before, and I came there to teach them how to move like peasants. And they are the ones who plant rice every single day. So that's what happens. I think I represent them. I think I want to teach them how to make art. But it's actually them who know better, you know? And that's what happens. Even when your intentions are good, that's what happens when you think you represent the people, but in fact, you're just in your ivory tower above them, looking from above and not with them and among them. And also, we think art should also be where it belongs. It should belong to the masses. So we should show movies in communities where there are no cinemas. We should hold concerts where there are no arenas. We should show theater plays where there are no theater houses. It should be part of the people's daily lives. It has always been like that until it has become a commodity and, you know, inclusive only to the people who have the right to have access to it. So, yes, in the society that we have now, artists are molded to become careerists. Do I pronounce it right? To treat it as a career. You have acquired the artistic skills, so make a career out of it. Make a name out of yourself. But this is the kind of system that we are fighting against. We should break away from this system. And as we create our own model of society, we should also create a new way of seeing and creating art. So we create art not to become artists. So in this case, we should also question who are the artists. We should not be as individuals who want to make a name. We shouldn't ask what it contributes to our resume, but what it contributes to the new world that we are building. So all of us here also, and I'm not excluding myself, we should question ourselves. We should ask ourselves, what are we actually doing? In this summit also, what are we doing in this summit? We talk, and it's good, you know, it's wonderful. It's an artwork also, but it's also important to ask, what for? Are we actually participating in it? If we go out after this long weekend of a lot of inputs about the society, if we go out today out of the door, if the people come to us and ask us, people who we have been talking about all weekend long, people who we are supposed to represent, if they ask us right now, what have you done for us? What have you done while we are being oppressed and exploited? And if my answer would just be, oh, I have painted about you, I have talked about you, I have made theater plays about you, if that is the only answer that we can give as artists, then I swear being an artist is the last thing I want to become. So again, just to emphasize, we can only create effective representations through direct participation. And we should not only represent the future, but we should build it. We should participating in building and making it a reality. Thanks.
Thanks. So already a suggestion here to change the title. That's a nice radical, no future representation, but future participations. Yeah, great. Okay, let's move to Emry with the same question. Of course, you have a huge history to look back on and a lot of work you've made. But if I ask you the question, which work worked in your, memory, what would you answer?
Well, it would initially have to start off with the pig drawing.
Yeah.
The pig drawing became an iconic figure that transcended the African American community as the symbol of oppression, to also transcending boundaries and borders. So it took on a new life of its own, where it became a symbol that everybody began to use to define the oppressor or the oppression that they were confronted with. And so therefore it became like a language, art as a language to communicate with. It was also a way of inspiring and informing through the symbolism of using the pig to show defiance against the system in regards to resistance in the art itself. You can also say that the earlier images that I did in context of the caricatures of the people in the community who began to see themselves in those artwork and would say they could identify their mother, their uncle. So therefore they became the images, they became the heroes. They became the performers on the stage in the artwork. And then through that they began to read and understand what was going on in the context of the artwork itself. So and it was not a me art, but it was a we art. It was an art that was a reflection of the politics, the ideology, and the philosophical perspectives of the Black Panther Party.
Because can you tell us something? How did it sort of come to life? This image of the police pigs. How was it created?
Well, it came to life when Huey Newton and Bobby Seale early on used to go out and organize, and we worked in a studio apartment with just a regular table.
This is Oakland?
Yeah, this is in San Francisco at Eldridge Cleaver studio apartment.
Okay.
This is before there was even a headquarters for the Black Panther Party.
Right.
And when Huey Newton and Bobby Seale would go out organize, they would come back. And while we were working on the paper, myself, Eldridge, and Kathleen Cleaver, they would be defining the pig and how they stood him down that day and what took place in the patrols. And so one day Huey said, well, I want you to draw this pig. And we're going to put the badge number of the pig who is intimidating and harassing people in the community each week. And that became the pig that I did on 4 hoofs.
So you sat down behind your table and you started to, to draw.
Well, I just, I thought about it, and I sat down. I did a pig on 4 hoofs first, but then I thought about it, and I said, why don't I stand it up on 2 hoofs, keep the tail, the snort, and they put the bandolier around it, and the badge, and the gun, and the flies, and that became the pig drawing. That became the iconic image that people began to identify with.
And it was iconic right away, or did it take a long time?
In the context of on the local level, and it began also in activists in the movement in the States, because we had close ties with the anti-war movement and the workers and all the other labor and teachers unions, all those became, even you had nuns and all those calling the police pigs. So it transcended in many ways, yeah.
So, but first it was the inner circle. First it was the audience of the blacks in San Francisco and Oakland who embraced it.
Yeah, wherever we had chapters and branches, but specifically in the Bay Area before we became a national organization, yes.
Okay. Because you talk about defiance. I mean, it's a very strong image. You really all have to go and see the book, or at least, go on internet and find the work of Emry. Because it also clearly speaks to those you depict. I think tell them also the story of this is perhaps what it feels like to be as violently depicted as inferior. So
Yes, it was part of a
so
psychological...
there's different, I'm talking about the audiences. It's for the inner use, but it's also clearly a message to those in control.
Oh, yes, it was like psychological warfare
Yeah.
in many ways, yes.
Yeah,
and
it's a
it
weapon
did
of
work.
war.
It did work in many ways. The police started a pig bowl where they played football, one team against the other in San Francisco and Oakland, trying to transform the image into something else than what it was. So it did have an impact.
Yeah.
In many ways, because there are laws in certain states now that you call the police a pig, you go to jail.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it came out of this work.
Yeah, it came out of that era, yes.
Yeah. And you must have met quite a serious amount of repression too.
Well, we did. As an organization, there was much repression. The counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, which is the program that was defined to destroy and to discredit the Black Panther Party by any means necessary. Of the many hundreds of schemes that they had to challenge and to destroy us, 99% of them was against the Black Panther Party itself, yes.
And how much did the label of art protect you in those days?
Well, the art didn't protect me.
No, but saying this is art, could you sort of protect yourself by saying this is artwork, you can touch it, this is...
Well, no, we didn't even think of it in those terms. It was a badge of honor to be able to be defiant. It was also a way, of fact, that people could also... There's another thing. The art was art that sometimes even people who looked at it could see that possibly this is something that they could do themselves in the art. You know, the art was, you know, it was like art that even a child could get a message out of. So it was broad in that context, without losing the depth or the meaning of what the art itself represented.
Yeah. So there we see sort of the same story, that your audiences are not people who sit down and read big books
there was
about...
people basically then, the African American community was not a reading community, but they learned through observation and participation. So they could get the gist of what the story was by viewing the images and the captions in the images, as opposed to some who weren't going to read the long essays and what have you, or articles. By seeing the images they could. There were Panthers in New York who sometimes used to sell the paper by turning it over each week on the back so that people could see the new artwork, and they got that much interest in the work. And from there they would be able to tell the story.
So
you
the
could
power
also
of the image.
Yes. You could also see what the politics of the party was transcending from one phase to another through the artwork as well.
Yeah. And if you would think about your own sort of development, who inspired you?
Well, I was inspired by the work that the Cuban artists, OSPAL, Organization of Solidarity with People from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They used to be, matter of fact, they used to remix some of the images that we did and make them into posters and send them over to third world countries in solidarity with their struggles. And so I used to look at a lot of the work that they did, the work that came out, the Palestinian struggles during that time, the Vietnam War, the anti-war movement, Russian posters, Chinese posters, doing it. All those were kind of inspirations to the kind of work that I, not necessarily trying to duplicate it, but being inspired by it.
Yeah, interesting. And if you would now look at the movement such as Black Lives Matter, situation of, the blacks in the US.
Yes.
What do you still think there's these iconic images that help to get people mobilized?
They have said Black Lives Matter is a broad movement. It's a really broad movement, and we have good relationships as elders and former Panthers and activists, and we continue to struggle. We've had discussions and meetings with them. There was one group called the Dreamers out of Miami, which I had about an hour conversation with them on the phone in regards to art and their interest in art, using art as a tool to organize and to enlighten. And so we were also invited to the national conference that they had in Cleveland because they wanted us there to be a part of it as well, along with other elders in regards to, so they have a lot of respect for what we represented, what we stood for.
Yeah. Okay.
And 50 years later, what we have is still the same thing happening 50 years later that we had 50 years ago. Yeah.
Because the police brutality is still,
yes.
a vital thing.
Yes.
And as an elder, perhaps looking at these new, young kids trying to sort of engage in the same kinds of struggles, Do you feel stuff is not being visualized? Still, you know, do you advise them on things you...
Yeah, I advise, but I also try to show them by example, by what I do. I do share images
So what do you see?
electronically.
What do you think they should do better?
Well, they should be more, and the art should be one that speaks to a broad audience. It should speak specifically to the issues. I think that they should perhaps try to understand that issue in its basic essence and try to interpret it from there so that it can be understood by everyone who may, a broad audience that may visualize and see the image itself.
Yeah. Because that is, I think, the magic of the iconic image. You know, that has that capacity to draw in many different people who recognize their struggles in that image. And that's also something that is really difficult and magical, I think.
Well, sometimes it just happens.
It happens, yeah.
And we were able to do it too because we had organization.
Yeah.
And we had chapters and branches.
Right.
And the community was our gallery at the time. We used to take papers out in the mornings before we went to sell them in old papers and posters, and we plastered them up over in the community.
Right.
So the community became the gallery.
Yeah.
So the people seen this on their way to work, going back and forth.
Yeah.
We also had them in barbershops and all these other places during that time.
So it's indeed, there we go again, it's not just the image, it's the organizational capacity that comes with, you know, producing an image that is vital for any form of mobilization.
And then there were our activists who also picked up the alternative papers, the radical newspapers, would pick up images and use them in their paper in regards to essays and things that they were doing in their paper as well.
Yeah, great. And your work still travels, as we now know.
Yes,
you know
I've been to Chiapas with the Zapatistas and done some of the work has been reinterpreted by them into embroideries.
Yeah.
Yes, and I've been over to Beirut, Lebanon, and done some work there at the Art Center. So I'm going to Palestine in about a month and a half. Then at the end of April, I'll be going to Cuba to participate in the Havana, Cuba Poster Festival.
Okay, coming back home to Cuba anyway.
Yes, yes.
Well, thanks a lot for sharing this very rich and inspiring story.
Thank you.
I'd love to turn to Richard Bell. And ask you again the same story. The work that worked. Why did it work? How did it work?
It's probably the work that the most recent one that I've done is the embassy. I decided to do this work after in 2012 was it? Callum was part of the sovereignty movement in Australia, which started protesting around, and they started activating all around Australia a good 12 months before Occupy and before, what's the other one? Idle No More. So these kids re-established tent embassies around the country. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic, you know, because the original tent embassy in Australia was set up by these young Aboriginal people.
In the 70s, right? It was
1972, yeah. And the Prime Minister at the time, he just said outright that there would be no land rights for Aboriginal people. That's what we were fighting for at the time. And so the response was to go down to Canberra, and the discussions about that action of going down to Canberra and letting the government know very clearly that Aboriginal people were not going to take this lying down. And part of the strategies of doing it, they were using metaphor and dance, interpretive dance, and all sorts of things.
But why an embassy? Who came up with that idea?
Well, there was one of the activists was a poet, and he came up with the idea. His name was Tony Curry, and he came up with the idea that the protest should be called an embassy, and that we should set up an embassy. And they said, well, why an embassy? You know, this is our own country. I said, well, he said, well, we're being treated like foreigners in our own country, so we need to have an embassy. And the fact that it was to be a tent embassy meant that it was collapsible, that it could be moved, you know, wherever. You know, if they took one down, we could get another one. You know?
Yeah, because it started out with just two chairs and
a beach umbrella.
Yeah, so, a beach umbrella, yeah.
So, yeah, they didn't have much of a budget. You know, they were very poor.
Basic art, yeah.
Yeah. So I've done this work where it's a homage, you know, to those young Aboriginal people. You know,
because from the beach umbrella, it grew into something.
Yes, much.
It was always there over the past 50 years.
Oh, it's 40 years. Well, it was 72. It's
a long time.
It's not,
ago.
yes, it's a long time. You know, like, way older than more than you people here. So, but yeah, and that. This embassy idea, you know, like it's struck a chord with people. I've been invited to Moscow, to New York, to
so
Amsterdam.
An image that really resonates.
Yes, it does. It does resonate with people. I think the magic of this, this and the idea of this tent embassy. People are wondering, what is this? You know, like, but this brings us back to this. Some of the discussions here. You know, like. We have to imagine victory. You know, we have to imagine what life would be like, because if we don't, you know, like it can't happen. Nothing has ever happened without it being imagined first. So we have to imagine, you know, that the left will unite. You know, like in the same way that the right wing does.
Yeah.
So, you know, just get behind one solid idea. You know, like. But the problem with that is that, you know, we allow, you know, diversity of ideas on the left side of politics, and that tends to be taken over by ego, I guess.
Yeah, and branding and the whole commercialization of art and all that.
Yeah, that's right.
Because can you say something about the tent embassy that is now based in Amsterdam?
I didn't get that much of a budget from the Stateless, so I've gone back to a beach umbrella. In Russia, I had better budgets. So I've gone back to something similar and just recreated the signs in the handwriting of those first signs. And with the exhibition, I invited Emry Douglas to come and help, because this is the first time I've shown solo in Holland. So I thought, well, for me to connect with an audience, you know, like I need to be talking about issues that are important to the people here. So I had Vivian, the curator, you know, make contact with some local people. She got in contact with the young lady from the hip hop house in Rotterdam, and they've found a couple of artists. One who's got his own graphic design business, and he participated, and another artist who does works with fabrics and that sort of thing. She did a T-shirt that's said "fuck the police" in Arabic. And so, we had a copy of that T-shirt in the show. And look, all my friends tell me that the show is fantastic. You should go and have a look at it. You know, so.
What does the tent allow you to do? What does it stand for?
Well, it's symbolic. You know, like and that's the major thing with it is the symbolism that it holds. You know, the power that this thing represented. You know, the hopes and aspirations of Aboriginal people. You know, like, remember, we had nothing. We just most of us had come through living on Aboriginal reserves, you know, which is like reservations in the US, and I'm sure the South Africans had a similar thing there. And It was, what, 5 years before there was a referendum which gave the federal government rights to make laws, you know, like for us, and that was quite significant. But out of that, there was this new group of people, you know, like my generation came through, and they weren't happy just to sit back and be nice, you know. Like what they did was very un-Aboriginal. You know, like what I do as an artist is very un-Aboriginal. It's
Why is it?
Well, to have an opinion and to espouse it loudly is un-Aboriginal.
Yeah.
So
You've been disciplined into silence and submission. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, yes. You know, like basically, and we just said, well, you know, like that's not working. So we wanted to do different things, and we imagined, you know, what we could do, I suppose. So
yeah.
I suppose that's what we have to do now. We have to imagine what can be done. You know, like look at how we can better our circumstances for everybody. I imagine.
Well, thanks for that very inspiring story. Round of applause for Richard. And the great thing is to have these two generations sitting next to each other, because we have Callum here, and also involved in, you know, struggles for their Aboriginal rights, using another prop in a way to draw attention and to imagine rights and self-determination. So can you share your story about the work that works?
Sure. So I guess the most important thing is to provide some historical context to our Aboriginal passport. It was first used in 1987 by an Aboriginal delegation that went over on invitation of Colonel Gaddafi's Libya when he was looking for friends in the West. And some Aborigines from Tasmania were the only ones who are apparently crazy enough to go over there. And the same thing happened in 1988. Another delegation, a bigger delegation, went over. The media went crazy. Politicians were saying these guys are collaborating with terrorists. One politician in the Queensland Parliament, I think, said, oh no, they should be tried for treason and all of this kind of stuff. And the Aboriginal passport came out of, much as the Aboriginal Tent Embassy did, the Aboriginal land rights movement, and also the need to go above and beyond the idea of just land rights to political independence, self-determination, and these kinds of ideas. And the Aboriginal passport...
And mobility too, right? Because it also stands for mobility, I think, to be able to...
Yeah, definitely. And
get out.
And it's a statement, it's not only a symbolic thing, but it's a practical thing. But symbolically, what it means is that we as a people, as a distinct people, reject the nationality of Australian, reject this nationality and identity that's been imposed on us, that's only existed for 228 years. Our identity, our Aboriginality, my identity as an A1 man has existed for tens of thousands of years. All of a sudden, post the 1960s, post the 1950s, there was this policy of assimilation. And this policy of assimilation, they wanted to turn the Aborigine into the Australian. And this Aboriginal passport, used by those early delegations and used by other delegations going to places like the South Pacific Forum in Vanuatu in the mid-90s, and most recently, what we did in 2014 is myself and 3 other young Aboriginal activists, we went over to Canada. We weren't so lucky to have Colonel Gaddafi to stamp our passport on entry to Libya because we were going into another colonial state controlled by colonial authorities. We turned up in Canadian customs and immigration and handed over our 4 Aboriginal passports, and they looked at it, oh, we're not sure if this is okay, we'll just send you over to this line over here. We ended up being detained for almost an hour, and they turned around to us and said, well, sorry you guys, we get that you're trying to assert your rights, but no, we won't accept it. On re-entry into Aboriginal land, via Brisbane and Melbourne international airports in 2014. Australian Customs detained us as well, all 4 of us, and they kept asking us, no, we need your Australian passport, otherwise blah, 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 blah. And we kept saying, no, we're Aboriginal people, this is our Aboriginal passport, and this is the travel document that we intend on using. And eventually they had to let us through. What are they going to do, deport us to our country of origin?
So because you prepared for this, right? You trained for this, I bet. You made sort of...
We're lucky to have a couple of...
probably in front of the mirror saying, you know, this is what I demand.
We were myself and Bo Spearham, we came through Brisbane International Airport, and me and Bo were standing in line and thinking, oh, we're not allowed to go to the electronic passport, the Australian passport line, we've got to go through the international line because the machine won't take it.
Yeah.
And we're saying, oh, this is what we've got to say, Bo, this is what we've got to say, like this.
Yeah.
But we'd had legal advice beforehand just to say this, we're Aboriginal people, returning to our country on an Aboriginal passport. And luckily, and I guess this was a bit of a big thing for the idea of the Aboriginal passport and recognition of it internationally, was last year myself and Pakiri Ruska went over to the Solomon Islands, and Solomon Islands Customs stamped and accepted the Aboriginal passport on entry and exit from Honiara when we went over there to talk with the West Papuan Independence Movement for the Melanesian Spearhead Group Summit. Before that, obviously Libya had accepted it, Norway and Sweden back in the early 90s, Vanuatu, and also I think significantly, rather than just looking for colonial states to accept and ratify the Aboriginal passport, we looked to other Indigenous peoples, other colonised peoples to build relationships with. So when we went to so-called Canada, colonial Canada, we were privileged to spend some time with the Mohawks in Kahnawake, and they also have their own Indigenous passport, the Haudenosaunee passport, and they stamped our passport, and above and beyond Canada and Australia and any of these other colonial states stamping our passport, that's far more of a, I guess, a positive. They're a legitimate authority, and we recognise that, and they recognised when they stamped our passport, and we went through traditional protocol with them, and that was far more important than getting
in
the
terms
Canadian
of recognition.
customs.
Yeah. Do you know who started this? Are you the first who made their own passports and start traveling with it? Did you take inspiration from an example?
I'm not sure where the guy who originally created it was Michael Mansell, and I'm not sure where he got the idea from. But I know the Mohawks, the Haudenosaunee, they'd been issuing passports since the late 70s, so before us. I know recently we've seen an Indigenous group in Ecuador using it as well. So I think it's something that...
So it's an idea that sort of pops up in different places, but also is maybe traveling, or people get inspirations. Say again?
The first one was the Iroquois Nation in 1923.
Really? Yeah. Okay. That would be a great study, the first sort of
it's been going on,
passportization of unrecognized identities. Yeah, great. Okay, so this is really an example of sort of performing sovereignty, performing self-determination, also a very interesting way of sort of bluffing and mocking and mimicking at the same time. So
I guess it has 3 effects when this turns up in the newspapers and on television. The words Aboriginal passport in big gold lettering and an Aboriginal flag, red, black and yellow emblazoned across the front. It courts the media. The media are like, oh, what's this again? Oh, we've got to cover this. So it's, I guess, an effective tactic on the part of the Aboriginal movement to use this kind of strong symbolism and strong imagery and such an amazing concept that was they came up with back in the 80s. And the second thing is it angers racist Australia. So you get all the rednecks and all the racists and all them lot up in arms, and we had the immigration minister, the federal immigration minister, on live radio calling it a nonsense passport, that we're all Australians, like continuing on with that kind of rhetoric. And the third and most important, I think, is inspiration for our own people to it's a symbol that we are our own nation, we are our own people, we have the right to determine our own political status, and this is an example of how we can do this symbolically and politically.
Yeah. So this is not just waiting for the state, but just doing the state in a certain way, or doing citizenship, at least. Yeah. Excellent. How many people carry the passport?
There's been somewhere between 200 and 300 passports issued since the Aboriginal Provisional Government, which is now the issuing body for the passport, came into being in 1990. And that was an organisation that was set up not to govern Aboriginal people, it was set up to campaign and push for the concept of Aboriginal self-determination and self-government. And just in, say, the last 3 years, there's been a bit of a revival with the next generation of Aboriginal activists taking up the Aboriginal passport as a means of forcing the issue. And I guess when it comes to forcing the issue, back in 2014, we launched a new organisation called Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance. And this organisation came out of the need for a new platform for young Aboriginal people to put our political views out there with regards to the Aboriginal movement, Aboriginal rights, and in front of the world's cameras when Tony Abbott was rabbiting on in the convention centre about something, we burnt a whole set of Australian flags. And that in itself has certain symbolic value in rejection of the state and all of that, but it's purely reactionary. Whereas something like the Aboriginal Passport, it's both reactive and assertive at the same time.
Yeah, forward-looking, constructing new identities, yeah. Great, thanks a lot for sharing this amazing story. Vivian, enough stuff to reflect upon, I'm sure, so I'd love to give you the first reaction, and then we're going to open up for inquiries.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a challenging and a very humbling set of positions to reflect upon. But it's absolutely an honour to be part of a session which, to the best of my knowledge, is the first session within the now many years long history of the New World Summit in which there have been presentation of people from Aboriginal nations. And I think there's something that's very interesting that's happening within this particular session, which is perhaps a radicalisation of the question of the non-citizen. Certainly in its earlier phase, I think the New World Summit was best known for delegations and representations of people who were stateless in the sense of claiming the condition of the state, or at least of being on a black list, as I understand. But I think that it's interesting to arrive at this point now where the members of this panel are from Aboriginal nations, so nations within settler colonies, or are from groups whose experience of citizenship is also violently limited and curtailed by experiences of policing in Black America and by economic conditions in the Philippines. But I think that is the commonality. Throughout the exhibition that we prepared last week, Bell Invites, which was quite an amazing crash course in Black radical artistic production for me as a curator, and one that I'm grateful to have had, the question repeatedly came up, but what does an Aboriginal rights activist from the 60s, a Black Panther from the 70s, and these University of Colour and hip-hop kids from the Netherlands have to do with each other? Why is this relevant? And it became very quickly very clear that the reason is that they all know intimately, deeply, Anglo-European technologies of dispossession, and have the capacity to produce images that articulate them and that are therefore immediately immensely relevant to shared projects, even though the bases of those claims and the material details of those claims shake down to very different things in terms of Aboriginal land rights, or wishing not to be the subject of occupation of police forces. To draw a particular history of that, I think it's also significant to point out that the imagery of the police pig also arose in the same year as the establishment of the SWAT force, so the Special Weapons and Tactics Forces in the United States. So it's the moment of the turning of militarization of policing against civil populations. Likewise, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy arose in 1972 in Australia, some years after Aboriginal people had been afforded the right of citizens, and yet at which the government had declared that there would be no land rights. So again, it's an image of defiance that rose up against a denial of the presence of citizenry. So the point is to end in a discussion. I guess one of the things that I've learned also very strongly in everything that's been said here, but also in the process, is the way that art, as I've learnt it to be practiced by the people here, is a mandate. And it's something that gives permission. The exhibition that we started to put on Monday was a technical material impossibility. There was no way in hell that thing was going to happen. We were all sort of sitting there going like, oh, okay. But there is something within what the images that Emry has been making since 1968, the art that Richard practices, and the tradition that he honours when he honours the Tent Embassy, that meant that every single day of installing that exhibition, I would look up and there would be 6 to 15 kids from the University of Colour Network and from the Hip Hop Network, who I'd never seen before in my life, walking in the door, picking up a brush and putting the show together, including guys from the We Are Here network, who, as we know, have a lot to do with their lives, who also came in, moved ladders and scrubbed floors for the show to happen. It meant that when the show opened, we counted, I think, up to 400 people through the door, and also, in my 5-year experience, by far the most diverse audience and the most engaged audience. And I think what I learned was that response and that participation is in the work. It's in the images when they were made in 1978 by Emry and by Richard. So there's something, I mean, Yola's sort of invoked the term of magic a couple of times, and I'm not afraid to sort of say that the best language that I found for that is that an artwork is something like a spell. It contains within it a mandate and a demand and a sense of permission that continues. And we are, as has been said today, in an artwork. We know it's an artwork because it's being paid for, because it's an artwork. Its business model is an artwork. And so the question is the spell that we are creating today. To continue on that, I'm interested to ask a few more questions about this idea of what the business model of art is, of a we art, not a me art. And I'm interested to start by asking you, Callum, what is the economic category of the passport? Because passports are in some ways, well, as the We Are Here guys could certainly tell us, are economic objects. Can I buy an Aboriginal passport? Can I become an Aboriginal citizen? Or is it something more complex than that? And I'm interested to ask you both about the idea of doing business as well, and what that means.
The question of can non-Aboriginal people get an Aboriginal passport has been asked a million times, and the response, the very subtle, the very blunt response that has been given by Michael Mansell, the guy who came up with the idea in the first place, is you can get one once we get our country back. So, and in terms of an economic thing, like we have a model where if you're unemployed, it's I think $25, and if you're employed, it's $40 or $50 or something like that. So, and in terms of covering costs and everything, it's just the bare minimum. So, yeah.
Oh. What was the question?
About what it means to do business.
Oh, to do business. Look, I'm sure that there's probably business opportunities there to be had. You know, we have to come to terms with living in a modern world. You know, like there isn't much chance of us surviving. You know, like if we don't adapt to some in some way, you know, to what's happening around us. You know, like well, you know, we adapt. You know, with clothes. You know, we adapt by living in cities and that sort of thing. So, I imagine that we would do business, but I think it would be much more carefully thought out than what happens now. You know, like in the Eastern Hemisphere, things are not looked at. You know, like in an election cycle, that looked at 50, 100, 150 years out. So our view is like that. So if we think that in 50 years' time coal's not going to be there, we're not going to be digging it out of the ground. So things like that. We're not going to pump dangerous chemicals down into the ground to release gas and that sort of thing. So I'm not ruling out business opportunities. Although I'm pretty sure that there'll be environmental company who's got a system that's competing with what's that, Tesla already. So I'm sure there's lots of stuff happening.
I'm going to wrap it up. I think you really energized us with your stories and your very concrete performances and actions. I think that's a great, learning experience, particularly for me, but I think way more people here in the room are inspired by your stories. I want to just 2 minutes see where we stand now. Last day in the summit. Yeah, give me 2 minutes to sort of reflect on where I think we are. I think in our summit we see a variety of repertoires of contention drawing on the old idea, actually, of revolution or reform. Old books have been written about that dilemma. Are you engaging in overthrowing radically the social order, political order, or are you trying to reform it? And I think we see different strategies into that sort of dilemma that is often seen as an either-or option. I'm happy to see Nancy in the room back with us, because I think Nancy and Birgitta on the first evening showed us how you can work within and against the state, using the law and using lawmaking, because I don't think Birgitta stated that strong enough. The amazing work she's doing in terms of making laws for secure information and aiming for building, turning Iceland into one of these rare safe havens for privacy and information. I think that's great work, and she's trying to make these laws. So using the law, making law, while struggling for justice and the right to privacy and information. And you both make use of the repertoires and the tools offered by the state structure in your resistance against it, in a way. And I also think we've seen that we are here, people, in a way, the stories I've heard from you, also sometimes using the way you're now trying to get access to buildings, to have your people live somewhere, also sort of work within the system at times while resisting it, and the dilemmas that poses for your movement. Many other examples discussed so far, the Rojava Aboriginal Black Panther movement, the movement of the Philippines. We see people not necessarily working within the state, but sort of performing self-determination, or in a way perhaps performing elements of statehood, the doing things differently as a performance, the creation of new collectives and forms of social order, often in the midst of repressive environments. So in a way, I think that's very inspiring to see you perform the new, acting out alternative in the midst of the old. And of course, coming back to where we are here today, this, for most of you who are not from Utrecht University, you have no clue the sense of this place, the bombastic, nationalistic, male-dominant patriarchy of this place. This is a place. I mean, I am from the university. I love being an academic, but I have a very difficult relation with this room. It's solemn. It's about the cloaks and the hats and the professors moving in, sitting up there, and we can sit here in the audience, and we're all hoping one day we might end up there, with them in these black cloaks and having a hat on and being a professor. So it's very hierarchical, and it's very, to me, grim. And it's about gender, definitely, because it's basically males sitting up there. Still in the Netherlands, 17% of our professors is female. So that's something we're not that proud. I'm not proud of. So to see this turn into something very different, you know, something way more horizontal. The stage is disappeared. In the back we see this cathedral thingy that normally you have to climb up and have, you know, give your speech from up there. So the audience is sort of submitted here down into obedience. You have to shut up, you have to be quiet. You never can ask a question, that kind of game. And how Jonas and his crew and people have sort of changed that around for these few days, to me, is a little revolution in itself. So, but of course, again, we're in this horizontal, beautiful forum, but we're still struggling we encountered a problem of who's entitled to speak and who has to shut up, you know, sort of. I have a lot of students with me who are very excited and asking questions, and they didn't get the time to really, you know, ask the questions. So I know Richard told me he's going to shut me down in 10 minutes because we have democracy here. So again, you know, it is not an ideal situation. Nevertheless, you know, the way it looks so beautifully, we still have games. We're playing games about entitlement and legitimacy and who can speak and who has to listen. So we can't solve that. But I think we had a great panel. We learned a lot. And I think this dichotomy of reform or revolution, it shows that we can do both, as long as we start acting and imagining our way out of the crisis and performing that imagination. So thanks for being here. And